All right, so we finished chapter 11 with starting to see this very twisted, dark side come out of Dorian, right? I mean, he starts to take all of these years, and remember, that's the longest chapter in the book. It's like 20 pages. And it's because years are passing and he is going into the study of all of those things that I mentioned before. It was religion and iconography and textiles and jewelry. And then he started to become fascinated with murder. And the last line of 11 reads, "There were moments when he looked on evil simply as a mode through which he could realize his conception of the beautiful." And I close by saying that that's kind of like what serial killers think, right? That they see beauty in what they do. And not to say that Dorian's going to end up being a serial killer, but we certainly have in here some foreshadowing of another part of Dorian's character that is really changing, right? When I was talking about character arc before and how these choices that he's making are going to change who he is. We begin on 12 with a new date. We actually have a date and we have an age. So remember, last time we checked, he was 25. Chapter 12 begins, it was on the 9th of November, the eve of his own 38th birthday. So now think about this. Young Dorian, when he's introduced to us, is a 19-year-old, fresh-faced, gorgeous man who everybody is kind of obsessed with how beautiful he is, right? Then about 25 years, in chapter 11, there were starting to be this dichotomy between how he was being perceived. So we had people saying, oh, when you looked at him, he looked so unspotted, he looked perfect. And yet there's rumors of him being exactly the opposite from unspotted. In fact, there's rumors of him going into the East End in Whitechapel, which is like where men of his stature would not consort with people over there. And there's rumors of him getting into fights, and there's rumors of him having young companions that are male. And so people are starting to talk. Now, can you imagine how a face changes, how a body even changes from 19 to 38? You're talking nearly 20 years of aging. And Dorian Gray still looks as perfect as 19 years old, as perfect as that picture when he first saw it, right? Now, of course, we know that the picture has changed. Who knows by now how significantly, but here we start to see Dorian's really make a move that is quite shocking for us as readers. He's going to be 38 years old. It's a foggy night, and someone's knocking on his door. Someone was there as he passed him, and it was Basil Hallward. A strange sense of fear for which he could not account came over him. He made no sign of recognition, went on quickly in the direction of his own house. But then Basil, of course, is looking for him and notices him and says, "Dorian, what an extraordinary piece of luck." Da, 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 da. Then he mentions, "I'm going to be out of England for 6 months. I intend to take a studio in Paris and shut myself up till I finished a great picture I have in my head. However, it wasn't about myself I wanted to talk." Now, he's concerned. Now, remember, Basil's the good friend. He's concerned here that people are talking about Dorian, and as his friend, he wants to let them know, right? And Dorian says, "What is this all about? I hope it's not about myself. I'm tired of myself tonight. I should like to be somebody else." And Basil says immediately, "It is about yourself, and I must say it to you, I shall only keep you half an hour." And Dorian's like, half an hour? Right? Oh my gosh. Now remember, he's annoyed with Basil. Basil is his friend, but he doesn't really hang out with Basil. Basil is not one of those companions that he keeps in the country house or even entertaining in his house in London. You know, Basil's kind of like more an acquaintance now. "It is not much I ask of you, Dorian, and it's timely for your own sake that I've been speaking. I think it right that you should know that the most dreadful things are being said against you in London." Okay, so people like started to talk, and now people are being a little bit more forthcoming. Dorian says, "I'm just really not interested." And Basil's like, "Well, you should be interested. It's your reputation." And then he said, "Mind you, I don't believe these rumors at all. At least I can't believe them when I see you. Sin is a thing that writes itself across a man's face." Okay, now there's much to be discussed about whether you think that is true or not, right? And then we continue to go a couple of pages ahead, and Basil is going on and on and on about things, and then about all these rumors that are going around Dorian, and people are thinking ill of him. And he says, your name was implicated in the most terrible confession I ever read. I told him that it was absurd, that I knew you thoroughly, that you were incapable of anything of the kind. Know you. I wonder, do I know you? Before I could answer that, I should have to see your soul. And of course, Dorian is like so on edge. Remember, we were talking about how paranoid he is now. He says, to see my soul. Like that was like it for him. That was like his trigger, right? And then Basil says, yes. He said, to see your soul, but only God can do that. Now, of course, a bitter laugh of mockery breaks from Dorian's lips. You shall see it yourself tonight. Come, it is your own handiwork. Why shouldn't you look at it? You can tell the world all about it afterward if you choose. Nobody would believe you. If they did believe you, they would like me all the better for it. I know the age better than you do, though you prate about it so tediously. Come, I tell you, you have chattered enough about corruption. Now you shall look on it face to face. And now as the reader, we're like, wait a minute, all of a sudden Dorian's just going to show Basil this portrait. He's been spending the majority of this book, right? Like we only have this much left in the book. The majority of the book is him hiding it, being paranoid about it, being nervous about it. Now all of a sudden he's just going to just show it to him like that. And so he says, well, yeah, you can't see. And so Dorian is going to take Basil up to see this thing. It reads, Dorian Gray smiled. There's a curl of contempt in his lips. Come upstairs, Basil, he said quietly. I keep a diary of my life from day to day, and it never leaves the room in which it is written. I shall show it to you if you come with me. I shall come with you, Dorian, if you wish it. I see I have missed my train. That makes no matter. I can go tomorrow, but don't ask me to read anything tonight. All I want is a plain answer to my question. And the last line is, that shall be given to you upstairs. I could not give it here. You will not have to read long. Okay, so very short chapter, right? Just a couple of pages, 5 pages maybe. Then we move to chapter 13, and we begin now with Dorian leading Basil to where the painting is. And if you'll recall, the painting is in Dorian's attic, where he grew up, right? Under Lord Kelso's care, his grandfather. Now, this is where light and dark really start to play a big part in the book, okay? He passed out of the room. They begin the ascent. Now they're climbing up. Okay, Basil's behind him. Oscar Wilde writes, they walked softly as men do instinctively at night. Okay, night is darkness, right? The lamp cast fantastic shadows on the wall and the staircase. So now we have the lamp. Dorian is holding a lamp as he's walking upstairs, as was common. They would carry their lights with them. And the shadows are being projected against the wall, against the staircase. When they reach the top of the landing, Dorian set the lamp down on the floor. He takes out his key and he says, you insist on knowing, Basil? And he says, yes. And then he says, I am delighted. And then he added a little harshly, you're the one man in the world who's entitled to know everything about me. You've had more to do with my life than you think. And now he picks up the lamp again. He opens the door, goes in, and it's a cold air that goes in. And so much so that the light on the lamp shoots up. Okay? And so it's a flare. Shot up for a moment in a flame of murky orange. Now, that's a signal of danger. Okay? Usually it's the color red that signals danger. That's always true in literature. But also fire, right? Because fire is kind of like the color orange and red, especially when it shoots up like a flame. And it says here, a flame of murky orange. So we should know, as far as a foreshadowing moment, there's some kind of danger that's going to happen in this room. Now, we know the danger is that the painting is there, and who knows what that looks like. So Dorian shudders. He says to Basil, shut the door behind you, he whispers, and he places the lamp on the table. Okay, now Basil's looking around and he's like, why are we in an attic? And he notices things. And Basil Dorian doesn't even care what Basil's looking at this point. So he turns his attention to Basil and he says, so you think that it's only God who sees the soul? Okay, draw that curtain back and you will see mine. And Wilde writes, the voice that spoke was cold and cruel. So everything about Dorian is changing except his face and his body. But his temperament, his tone of voice, his actions, his choices, the way he is carrying conversation, his paranoia, his nervousness. So everything is changing. And then Basil's like, you're crazy. Like, what are you talking about? So Dorian says, you won't, then I'll do it for myself. And he tears the curtain from the rod. So much so the force is he's pulling this curtain out that's been placed in front of the picture so no one can see it, and he tears it with such a ferocity that he actually breaks it from the rod. And an exclamation of horror broke from the painter's lips. Now, let's see what they see. There was still some gold. No, let's look at this whole thing, right? An exclamation of horror broke from the painter's lips as he saw in the dim light the hideous face on the canvas grinning at him. There was something in its expression that filled him with disgust and loathing. Good heavens, it was Dorian Gray's own face that he was looking at. The horror, whatever it was, had not yet entirely spoiled that marvelous beauty. There was still some gold in the thinning hair, some scarlet on the sensual mouth. The sodden eyes had kept something of the loveliness of their blue. The noble curves had not yet, completely passed away from chiseled nostrils and from a plastic throat. Yes, it was Dorian himself, but who had done it? He seemed to recognize his own brushwork. The frame was his own design. The idea was monstrous. He was afraid. He seized the lighted candle. Now, Basil takes the lighted candle. Now, remember what I told you, light means it's a reflection of truth. Right? And held it to the picture. In the left-hand corner was his own name. So he's thinking maybe it's mold, right? Like this, you haven't taken care of this picture. Something is really wrong with it. He's speechless. And the young man was leaning against the mantel shelf, watching him with the strange expression that one sees on the faces of those who are absorbed in a play. So Dorian is just sitting there and just watching him in his horror. And notice how Wilde is referring to him constantly as the lad, and here as just like literally a translation for lad, young man. Dorian is nearly 40 years old and he looks like he's 19. What does this mean? Cries Basil. Years ago when I was a boy, and now the entire book in this one quotation from Dorian, the entire book is summarized. Years ago when I was a boy, said Dorian Gray, crushing a flower in his hand, you met me, flattered me, taught me to be vain of my good looks. One day you introduced me to a friend of yours who explained to me the wonder of youth, and you finished a portrait of me that revealed to me the wonder of beauty. In a mad moment that even now I don't know whether I regret or not, I made a wish. Perhaps you would call it a prayer. And Basil says, oh my God, I remember it. No, the thing is impossible. The room is damp. Mildew has got it. The paints have some poison. Ah, what is impossible? Murmured the young man. You told me you destroyed it, Basil says. I was wrong. It destroyed me. I don't believe it is my picture. Can't you see your ideal in it, says Dorian bitterly. My ideal, as you call it, as you called it. There was nothing evil in it, nothing shameful. You were to me such an ideal as I shall never meet again. This is Basil. This is the face of a satire. Dorian says, this is the face of my soul. Reality versus ideal. Again, what is reality versus appearance? Another theme. Sometimes what you see is not real. What we are seeing is not the reality of what it is, right? Christ, what a thing I must have worshipped. It has the eyes of a devil. Each of us has heaven and hell in him, Basil, cried Dorian. My God, if it is true, and this is what you have done with your life, why? You must be worse even than those who talk against you who fancy to be. Now, this is where things turn. Basil was always Dorian's biggest fan. He was his cheerleader. Basil was the one who would always vouch for Dorian's goodness. Dorian didn't realize he needed that until now, because now Basil's going to turn on him. And the second Basil turns on him, Dorian is going to react. Now, I don't think that Dorian planned to kill Basil in this scene before he brought him up. I don't think even at this moment Dorian had a premeditation to kill Basil. I think that Dorian's life of ennui was getting so tedious and he had done everything possible, sated every desire, and he had no satisfaction. And so he's bored to death. But when Basil turns on him, it's too much. Because then the one person who still looked at him as that perfect face, that perfect beauty, now despised him. And it's too much for Dorian. You must be worse even than those who talk against you fancy you to be. Basil's holding up a light against the canvas, examining it. The surface seemed to be undisturbed. It seems like the foulness is coming from within. Now Basil's hand is shaking. The candle falls from its socket on the floor and lays there sputtering. So now darkness has overtaken the room, right? The light has fallen to the ground. Darkness has overtaken the room. He placed his foot on it, put it out, and then he flung himself into the rickety chair that was standing by the table and buried his face in his hand. Good God, Dorian, what a lesson. What an awful lesson. There was no answer, but he could hear the young man sobbing at the window. Pray, Dorian, pray. What is that one was taught to say in one's boyhood? Lead us not into temptation, forgive our sins. So Basil is now taking this opportunity and saying, you can, if this is a reflection of your sin, you can make atonement for it. You can ask for forgiveness, make a confession. God will forgive you and you will be restored. Your soul will be restored, because what I'm looking at is just terrible. If that's really a reflection of who you are. Dorian Gray turned slowly around and just says, it's too late. It is never too late, Dorian. Let us kneel down and try if we cannot remember a prayer. Isn't there a verse somewhere? Though your sins be as scarlet, yet I will make them white as snow. Those words mean nothing to me now. Hush! Don't say that, says Basil. You've done enough evil in your life, my God. Don't you see that accursed thing leering at us? And this was the last thing that Basil says. He calls the image accursed. A-C-C-U-R-S-E-D. As if it's a cursed thing. Cursed, doomed. As in failed. As in ugly. As in outcast, heinous, like a leper, right? And that's when Dorian crosses. Dorian Gray glanced at the picture, and suddenly an uncontrollable feeling of hatred for Basil Hallward came over him, as though it had been suggested to him by the image on the canvas, whispered into his ear by those grinning lips. The mad passions of a hunted animal stirred within him, and he loathed the man who was seated at the table more than his whole life he had ever loathed anything. He glanced wildly around. Something glimmered on the top of a chest that faced him. His eye fell on it, and he knew what it was. It was a knife that he had brought up some days before to cut a piece of cord, and he had forgotten to take it down with him. He moved slowly towards it. He passes Basil as he does so, and as soon as he gets behind him, he seizes it. He turns around. Hallward stirs in his chair as if he's going to rise, and Dorian rushes at him and digs the knife into the great vein in the behind the ear, crushing the man's head down on the table and stabbing him again and again and again. There's a groan and a horrible sound of someone choking with blood. And then the outstretched arms of Basil just twitch and twitch and twitch as he just gives up. He could hear nothing but the drip, drip on the threadbare carpet. He opened the door, went out on the landing. The house was absolutely quiet, right? This is Dorian now. No one was about. For a few seconds, he stood bending over the balustrade and peering down into the black, seething well of darkness. He's looking into the abyss right now. Dorian has just murdered his friend. Not only murdered him, but he killed him in cold blood, as many courts would call a crime of passion, as a matter of fact, because that's what stabbing is. And he's looking into the blackness. He takes out the key, he goes into the room, and he locks himself in. The thing was still seated in the chair. And now instead of the painting being the thing, Basil is the thing. I told you that Wilde was going to show us that ugliness is going to follow Dorian. As Dorian chases beauty, ugliness is on his heels with every choice that Dorian makes. And ugliness is going to start to climb up the back of Dorian's legs and back and overcome him. So much so that Dorian is going to start to be home in the ugliness. And you're going to see this coming up. The thing was still seated in the chair, straining over the table with bowed head and humped back and long, fantastic arms. Had it not been for the red, jagged tear in the neck and the clotted black pool that was widening on the table, he would have said he was just asleep. He kills him. He turns the key. He leaves. He doesn't even glance at the murdered man. He felt that the secret of the whole thing was not to realize the situation. Everything is still. It's the sound of his footsteps. He calls a friend to help him, Alan Campbell. And in chapter 14, which is where we're going to end our lecture today, we wake up the next day, and the first paragraph is just typical Dorian. At 9 o'clock the next morning, his servant came in with a cup of chocolate on a tray and opened the shutters, light pouring in. Dorian was sleeping quite peacefully Lying on his right side with one hand underneath his cheek, he looked like a boy who had been tired out with play or study. Dorian doesn't look like a murderer. Dorian doesn't look ugly or awful in any way, but he is inside. The man had to touch him twice on the shoulder before he woke. Dorian slept peacefully that night. That's bothersome, no? Youth smiles without any reason and is one of its chiefest charms. He's trying to contact somebody. We briefly get this reference to a book that he has received from a man called Adrian Singleton. That man is going to come back. Then he's reading all these things. I'm going to skip to after a time the book falls from his hand. He grew nervous and a horrible fit of terror came over him. What if Alan Campbell should be out of England? Days would elapse. And they give a little bit of backstory about how he knows Alan Campbell. It looks like they may have been lovers. It looks like definitely more than friends. Then continues more, some beautiful aphorisms and descriptions from Oscar Wilde regarding their friendship. And then again, how Dorian is musing on it. And Campbell shows up. And the first thing he says, Dorian says, "Alan, this is kind of you. Thank you for coming." And Alan immediately, just very blunt, "I had intended never to enter your house again." So Dorian brings an enemy in to help him with the situation. "You said it was a matter of life and death." "Yes, it is a matter of life and death, Alan, and not to more than one person. Sit down." So Campbell takes a chair. The men's eyes meet. In Dorian, there's pity. He knew that what he was going to do was dreadful. Now, we may think that Dorian committed the worst sin up until now, right? We know that he didn't physically kill Sybil. She killed herself. But we know that that would not have happened if he had not rejected her so coldly. He does kill Basil by his own hand. So we're thinking, oh my gosh, how much worse can it get? Well, the worst thing you can do, I think, in this life is not the sins you commit by your own hand, but those that you convince others to commit. Because now you've become like that influence that Henry was talking about and causing others to sin. Right? And I think that's the worst thing you can do. And that's exactly what he's doing here. "I don't want to know anything further. Whether you told me it's true or not, keep your horrible secrets to yourself. They don't interest me anymore." He tells him very clearly there's a man upstairs and he's dead. And he says, "You, Alan, you must change him and everything that belongs to him into a handful of ashes that I may scatter in the air." Alan immediately refuses. He says, "I don't care what shame comes on you. You deserve it." They go back and forth, and after a while, Dorian realizes Alan's not going to do it. So Dorian's like, "Okay, I'm going to force you like I had planned to." He says, "You refuse?" "Yes, I entreat you, Alan. It's useless." Look of pity comes again. Dorian takes out a piece of paper. He writes something on it. He folds it down in twice, gives it to Alan. Alan picks it up. He opens it, and Oscar Wilde writes, "As he read it, his face became ghastly pale. He fell back in his chair. A horrible sense of sickness came over him. He felt as if his heart was beating itself to death in some empty hollow. And after 2 or 3 minutes of terrible silence, Dorian turned around, came and stood behind him, putting his hand on his shoulder." What did I tell you? The image of Lord Henry sitting behind Dorian at the opera that night, that Sybil Vane, they found out she was dead, and he puts his hand on the shoulder. An image of dominance, an image of influence, but dominance mostly. "I'm sorry for you, Alan," he says, "but you leave me no alternative. I have a letter written already. Here it is. You see the address. If you don't help me, I'm going to send it. If you don't help me, I will send it. You know what the result will be. But if you're going to help me, it's impossible for you to refuse now. I tried to spare me. Do me some justice." And then he says, "The thing has to be done. Face it and do it." And so we can discuss, obviously, in class tomorrow what we think this letter that he's going to send is, but it could be him outing him to the police, right? That could be the address on it, like the police station. He goes up and he does it. He comes back down and it's done. And he says, "Hush, Alan, you've saved my life." "Your life? Good heavens, what a life that is. You've gone from corruption to corruption and now you have culminated in crime." And that is certainly where Dorian is. He has gone from corruption to corruption until he has become a criminal. It was long after 7 when Campbell came back into the library. He was pale but absolutely calm. "I've done what you asked me to do, and now goodbye. Let us never see each other again." "You've saved me from ruin, Alan. I cannot forget that," said Dorian simply. As soon as Campbell had left, he went upstairs. There was a horrible smell of nitric acid in the room, but the thing that had been sitting at the table was gone. And tomorrow in class, we are going to focus on the rest of the book, chapters 15 to 20. So be sure to finish it.